Welcome everyone. Welcome to everyone who's joining us. We're excited you're here. If you want to put in the chat where you're tuning in from, we'd love to hear that, see that. Welcome everyone. Welcome to those who have just joined us. Welcome to those who are joining us. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Welcome everyone. See some waves. If you want to put in the chat where you're from, we'd love to see where you're from tonight. Or if you're a parent, student, welcome. Let's see, we got lots of Lincolnshire, Long Grove, sophomore parents, Vernon Hills High School representing. Lots of parents tonight, some community coalitions. We're excited you're here. Freshman parents, welcome. Our friends at Omni, welcome. We're so excited that you're all here. Oh, Daniel, you got a shout out on our chat. Lots of parents, we're so excited you're here. Lots of Stevenson parents, we're glad you're here tonight. Lots are joining us. Nakasa, welcome. Casa, welcome. Buffalo Grove, welcome. We're so excited you're here. We got our middle schools represented. Welcome. Twin Groves. Thank you for being here. Oh, looks like maybe we have someone from a different coast that's morning for them. Buffalo Grove High School, welcome. We have some police officers joining us. Welcome, everyone. Claudia, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Good evening and welcome. We're so glad you've joined us for our fall Not My Kid presentation, Born to Be Wild, Why Teens Take Risks and How We Can Keep Them Safe. We have an incredible world-renowned speaker joining us this evening, and we look forward to spending this time with all of you. My name is Claudia Caston, and I am chair of Stand Strong Coalition. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Stand Strong Coalition and Catalyst, which is Stevenson's high school substance abuse prevention club. Stand Strong Coalition is a nonprofit, community-based coalition dedicated to preventing underage drinking and drug use for the youth in our community. In just a moment, I will introduce you to Carson Ezell, Catalyst's current president. On behalf of both of our organizations, we welcome you and are grateful that you have joined us. This event is traditionally held at Stevenson High School, but given the unique season that we are in, we are grateful to have the opportunity to host this event virtually. As we begin, I'd like to orient you to the Zoom platform we're using tonight. Along the bottom of your screen, you're going to see several icons. One is Q&A. Throughout the night, we invite you to share questions with our panelists. Your questions will be sent privately to us, and we will have time following the speaker's presentation to ask him your questions. To give you some practice using the Q&A function, we'd like to start our night off with a fun competition. In my hand, I have Dr. Shatkin's book, Born to be Wild. We will mail a copy of his book to the first person to answer this trivia question correctly in our Q&A chat. Are you ready? Now remember, it's the first person to answer this question. You'll win a copy of Dr. Shatkin's book. The question is, our speaker tonight hails from New York University. In which New York City borough is New York University, otherwise known as NYU, located? Again, the question is, in which New York City borough is New York University located? Go ahead and enter your response in our Q&A chat on your Zoom screen, and we'll announce our winner shortly. As you do that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Catalyst President Carson Ezell.
Thank you, Claudia. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our annual Not My Kid event. My name is Carson Ezell. I am a senior here at Stevenson, and I am the president of Catalyst for this school year. Catalyst is a club at Stevenson that focuses on substance abuse prevention work, and it is associated with the Stand Strong Coalition. Together, we organize Not My Kid each year. Beyond Not My Kid, Catalyst's work includes many initiatives every year to share our information with parents, staff, students, and other stakeholders in the community. And we also work on advocating for policy change that supports drug-free youth. One of our proudest accomplishments over the past few years includes helping to pass the Tobacco 21 legislation in Illinois, which raised the buying age for tobacco products to 21 years old. Catalyst is open to all students at Stevenson to join, and we're always happy to get new members involved in our work. So please share the opportunity with your teens. I'm now excited to share the winner of our trivia competition and the recipient of Dr. Shatkin's book, Born to be Wild. The trivia question was, in which New York City borough is New York University located? And the correct answer is Manhattan. And our winner tonight is Lynn Rosenbaum. Please share your address in the Q&A chat so we can send you Dr. Shatkin's book. Congratulations. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to my friend and fellow Catalyst member, Daniel Saltzman.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Saltzman, and I am a representative of the Catalyst Parent Committee. In terms of the Parent Committee specifically, we focus on creating awareness targeted towards parents about how their attitudes and behaviors can impact the lifestyles of their children. Our work includes meeting with parents, middle schools, and other organizations such as Stand Strong Coalition to help send the message about the importance of parents in the character of their children. Today, we are excited to introduce our national guest speaker, Dr. Jess Shatkin. Dr. Shatkin leads the educational efforts of the NYU Child Study Center, where he serves as Vice Chair for Education, along with Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Pediatrics at the NYU School of Medicine. In addition to directing one of the largest training programs in the country in child and adolescent psychiatry, Dr. Shatkin is the founder and director of the nation's largest undergraduate child development program, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Studies at NYU. His major clinical interests are mood and anxiety disorders, attention deficient hyperactivity disorder, disruptive behavior disorders, and sleep. Dr. Shatkin is a physician who cares for patients each day, and he is one of the country's foremost voices in child and adolescent mental health. Please join us in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Shatkin.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry we can't be live together, but I'm pleased that we have this opportunity to talk, and I'm excited to share with you some of what I know about adolescents and how they develop and the kind of risks that they take and why they take those risks. And we'll talk about that for a little while, and then we'll get into some strategies that we can think about using as to how to help manage some of those risks, and then we can get into dialogue together as well. Were we to be in the same room, I would do a lot of Q&A as we go. I think if you have questions along the way and you require clarification, put them in the chat box. I will keep an eye on that if I can and try and answer them, but we may end up having to get to them at the end if I can't keep up with the questions that arise. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and I'm hoping you can see that. We're good? Okay, I'm just going to open the chat box on my screen. Give me 1 second so I can keep half an eye on things. And if you have big questions, because I'm going to talk about some concepts, well, then some scientific concepts and things, and you let me know, please, and I will go ahead and try to explain them. So this is the topic for the day, managing high-risk behavior in teens. That seems to coincide pretty well with what your group is here to talk about, and these are my credentials. Here's some disclosures. This is the book that I'm going to be referencing in the talk today. I've also written a textbook on child and adolescent mental health, and if you like the way I talk and what I have to say, and you have clinical questions, or you just want to talk in general about mental health or listen, learn more, I have a show on Fridays I do on the Doctor Radio channel, which is Sirius XM 110. It runs 8 to 10 live on the East Coast and then repeated throughout the week. So this is the overview of what I want to talk with you about this evening. First, what risks do adolescents take? And I think that would be pretty short order for us, because I think we'll agree about what we're concerned about, but still it's good to remind ourselves. Then we'll talk about how adolescents think about risk. And I think you'll find something new there that you might not have thought of before or might not have considered, really because science has shown us that there are some differences in what we've learned and what we thought from the past. Why do adolescents engage in risky behavior? And that's a multifactorial explanation, but we'll get into that as well. It's not as simple as we once thought, so hopefully there's something new for you there. And how adolescents make decisions involving risk, I think, is also pretty new. And it's really those three reasons, 2, 3, and 4, why I wrote this book a couple of years ago. And of course, to keep up on all the practices that I try to use in my clinical care, in my administrative and public health work, things that we can do to help keep our kids safe. So this is what we're focusing on tonight, and I hope it interests you as much as it does me. So what risks do adolescents take? And if we were together in a room, I would say, so tell me about the risks that you took when you were young, or a friend took when you were young. And you would say things undoubtedly like drinking and driving. Swimming against the current, drinking and swimming against the current, having unprotected sex, driving too fast, texting while driving, jumping off the bridge into the river without, the 40 feet and not knowing what's underneath the river there. All sorts of things like this would probably come up for you, but drinking and driving, drug use, sexual activity, these are the big things. And these, as well as all the other factors that we worry about with our kids, are driven essentially by three things that change during puberty or around puberty, starting around 9 in some cases, because puberty starts early these days, but typically around 11, 12, 13, kids enter puberty and their emotions change, and their thinking or cognition changes. And those things combine to result in different behaviors than our kids have engaged in before. And things that they would have never considered at 8, 9, or 10 now become very reasonable at 15, or even if they're not reasonable, they still do them. And even if they know they're not reasonable, they still do them. So this is a lot of what we'll be talking about tonight. But 85% of the deaths that occur in kids 15 until 34, so not just children, but going all the way to 34, are in order: accidents, suicide, and homicide, 85% of the deaths. And those are all preventable things. So just some risks that we can all agree upon. Over 80% of high school students don't wear bicycle helmets. And, we understand that. Yet, if you'd want to talk about something that's very protective against injury or disability, it's wearing a helmet. 1 in 3 who ride motorcycles don't wear helmets. That's even more shocking, probably, because we know that that's a much greater danger to your health. In the past 30 days, 20% of high school students drove with someone who was drinking alcohol, 40% texted or emailed while driving, more than a third of sophomores have had sex, along with 50% of juniors, and nearly 60% of seniors in high school. So while we're not encouraging our kids to do these things necessarily, these things are fairly normative. If 60% of kids by their senior year have had sex, well, then sex is pretty common. Now, that does mean that 40% of kids haven't had sex, so it's not absolutely normative, but it's not surprising, and we have to be straight with ourselves about what's going on. But more concerning than having sex, in my mind, is that they didn't use condoms, 43%, or 14% didn't use any birth control at all. And as you might expect, this is higher amongst minorities. This is really higher amongst impoverished populations, but the statistics aren't gathered by income level. They're gathered by ethnicity. So higher amongst minorities, and more minorities live in poverty. And then we get into some really grisly statistics. 1 in 4 teen girls gets a sexually transmitted infection. 3 in 10 teen girls become pregnant, along with more than 50% of Latina teens in our country. So this is really quite concerning, because pregnancy is the #1 reason that girls drop out of school. And dropping out of school leads to a host of other high-risk concerns. You drop out of school, you're more likely to have more sexual partners, more likely to get pregnant again, you're more likely to end up in welfare, you're more likely to not get a good job, you're certainly not going to go to college, you're more likely to be abused or be in an abusive relationship, you're more likely to develop diabetes and hypertension and obesity and a whole bunch of things. So these are major risks that we have an opportunity to prevent, and we shouldn't be surprised that they're happening in teen years. 1 in 10 teen girls is forced to have sexual intercourse. 1 in 4 seniors binge drank in the last 30 days, along with more than 1 in 5 juniors and 1 in 6 sophomores. So again, fairly common behaviors. Over 1/4 of juniors and seniors smoked marijuana in the past 30 days. You may hear an occasional bark. That's my Lola, my dog, who comes in and out of the room sometimes. Now, I told you before that the leading causes of death amongst those 15 to 24, I said up to 34 because this slide doesn't show that, but it does go up to 34, is accident, suicide, and homicide, accounting for about 85% of the deaths. And I give you the statistics from 2013 because this is the first year, and I'm making the point by boxing it, that suicide surpassed homicide. So it had been accidents, homicide, suicide for many years, as long as the CDC was tracking these statistics, and then suicide moved up to the preeminent position, #2. And while these things are terrible when they happen, such as heart disease and cancers in young people, still they happen to some degree. But even the next 7 most common causes of death only account for 14% of the deaths in this age group. So really, it's accident, suicide, and homicide. And the fact that that suicide has climbed also says something about the stress and the mental health that our kids are dealing with. This is not only a factor of the Western world. If you look internationally, this is WHO data. They don't collect it every year, so the data is a little bit older. But 2012, road injury, which is accidents, HIV, much of which is congenital, not, that is, kids who are born with HIV, but suicide being #2, and interpersonal violence like homicide. So those 3 being very high. Of course, HIV, congenital, and lower respiratory infections because healthcare isn't available in some of these places. And then disability, things like depressive disorders and alcohol use and anxiety, major causes of disability in this age population. So the kids that we work with, the kids that we care for, the kids who we love, the kids who we teach, these kids are at high risk every day. And these risks are really mounting after puberty, when our kids are in many ways unprepared for them, which is why we see such high death rates of accidents, suicide, and homicide. Now, if you look at mental health, in 1999, the Surgeon General did a report on mental health. They do an annual report every year on something related to some healthcare issue, hypertension, diabetes, what have you. But in 1999, they did the first one ever on mental health. And they gave us a statistic that really shocked those of us who work in mental health. And that is that over 20% of children 3 to 17 meet criteria. DSM is our diagnostic code book in psychiatry, that 20% would meet criteria in those ages for some sort of mental illness. But then we did better studies. And our best study shows that even amongst teenagers, 13 to 18, 50% will meet criteria for some psychiatric disorder, 27% for a severe disorder, of which about 5% is substance use. So SUDS is substance use disorders. So about 22% will meet criteria for a severe disorder. Even during the teenage years alone, if you add substance use, it gets even higher. About 50% of all mental illness begins by age 14, about 75% by age 24. Another powerful statistic that I emphasize strongly with all my trainees and all the physicians and medical students I work with. This stuff doesn't happen terribly often by surprise. Yes, you can have a new episode of depression or anxiety at 40, but it's not that common. Usually it's been building, something's been happening before. The average amount of time the median amount of time, the time in the middle that it takes for people to get help from the time that they first experience a psychiatric disorder to the time that they first get help is 9 years. So there's an awful lot of pain and struggling going on that we're not picking up, and we have an opportunity to do that at school. Pardon me. You may have heard of ACEs. You may not have heard of ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And we now know for about the last 20 years that ACEs affect more than 50% of kids. ACEs are things like a divorce can be an ACE, but also a parent in the home who is incarcerated, a parent in the home who is abusing or abused, a child undergoing physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, drug use directly in the home, illegal drug use. And all of this is things that compound in children, so that the more ACEs you have, the greater risk you face for all sorts of negative health outcomes. But it's not only health outcomes like obesity, hypertension, and diabetes, it's also things like depression and anxiety and down the road stress disorders and things. So identifying this is very important for those of us who work in mental health. With all of these stressors, with all of these risks facing our kids, we shouldn't be surprised that 30% of high school students felt sad or hopeless for 2 or more weeks in the past 12 months. That's really quite a high number. 18% seriously considered attempting suicide, about 2 to 1 female to male, as after puberty, depressive disorders affect females about 2 to 1 to males. And almost 9% attempted suicide, 8.5%. So that's really, I think, quite shocking. If you look at a group of high school students, then you've got a class of 30, almost 3 of them have attempted suicide in the past year. So that's really quite concerning. And a lot of this is all the developmental changes they're going through, all the pressures and stresses they feel. And some of this results in the risk behavior that they engage in. And some of this difficulty they have is because of the risk that they're engaging in as well. So it's not just causing, but it's contributing. So who commits crimes? Again, looking at young people, what we find is that when the number of youth increases, so does the amount of crime. And you can see that here, that when we had a baby boom increase in the early 90s, we saw more crime, that half of all serious crimes are committed by those 10 to 17, that most serious crimes are committed by those under the age of 30, and that most youth criminal behavior happens in groups. So again, reasons for us to be really thoughtful about adolescence and what's happening with adolescents. So that was the first part of my talk. That's done. 1 out of 5, check. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how adolescents assess risk. So again, if we were in a room, I'd ask you questions. I'd say, why do adolescents take risks? And I would love to hear what you have to say about that. If you could tell me why adolescents take risks, but without, if you can pop it in the Q&A if you want, or in the chat if you want. But I'll go ahead and I'll start to address this. One of the reasons that people always say, there are a variety of things. Some people say it's the brain, the brain changes. Some people talk about puberty. All of that's valid. People often always say something about adolescents thinking they're invincible. And this is the first thing I want to dispel. So peer pressure, people are saying that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Some people say peer pressure. We're going to talk about peer pressure. That's a major factor. Seeking independence, separation from parents, right? I think that's part of it. Fun or curiosity, absolutely, I think is one of the things that goes on with kids. We have a good amount of science on this. The frontal lobe is not fully developed. That's one of those concepts around the brain. So I'm going to go through all of these in some painstaking detail with you so you really understand your kids. And my goal in this And this is really to help you develop more empathy for them. But the first thing I want to talk about is this dispelling the idea that kids engage in risk because they think they're invincible, because that's not the case. And adolescents, actually, it's quite the opposite. They always overestimate risk. And whether you're looking at low probability events like earthquakes and hurricanes, or higher probability events like accidents and pregnancy, what you find out is that kids overestimate risk. In fact, kids believe that the risk of contracting a sexually transmitted infection is between 6 and 60,000 times greater than it actually is. So if you ask a group of teenagers, and I will tomorrow ask teens and young adults in my psychopathology course that I'm teaching to 230 students at NYU this semester, I'll ask them, because we're on this unit, I'll say, what's the risk that you'll get a sexually transmitted infection from one-time intercourse unprotected with another person? Even if you don't know that person's sexual history, if they've never had sex, you don't know their sexual orientation, no details. And they will tell me 90%, 95%. They'll tell me the risk of pregnancy is 90%, 95%. This is not true. And the reason this is important, it's the reason we have to understand that adolescents even believe that the risk of them dying this year is over 200 times the actual risk. In study after study, sex rate or pregnancy rates, sexually transmitted infection rates, automobile accidents rates, death rates, they believe the risks are many, many, many times higher. The reason it's important we understand that they overestimate risk is that most of our health programming focuses on them understanding risk. So if you look at most of our risk programming, because we believe down deep that adolescents think they're invincible, why else would they do crazy stuff like drive while texting or drive while drunk or have sex without a condom? Why would they possibly think to do this? They must think they're invincible. And so most of our risk reduction programs are focused on increasing adolescents' understanding of risk. And so we teach them about risk. We say, you're not invincible. We say, you must have adult decision making. You must think like adults. Break it down in its small pieces like we believe that adults think. Remember what I just said. Like we believe that adults think. We'll come back to that later. But we believe that adults think as if they're sort of, very careful about breaking things down and thinking of every little option. That's how we believe adults think. And so we make a lot of effort, painstaking effort, to teach young people to think like that and to break every decision down into component parts. But this approach is misguided and doesn't work, and it results in these kinds of programs. Never was there a more idealistic program than DARE or Scared Straight or Zero Tolerance. And in most cases, these programs, certainly Scared Straight and Zero Tolerance, don't work. And most iterations of DARE don't work. In fact, these programs all make things worse. Now, there are some iterations. I heard somebody say that we have a police officer. So if there's a police officer in the audience who's doing a modern iteration of DARE where you're actually talking about, you're teaching kids how to have conversations about these things, and you're actually not giving them the data and telling them the risks, but you're actually having them practice how do you say no, or how do you have one beer and make it seem like it's 3 at a party, or how do you make sure you're getting home safely. Those are very good skills to learn, but the usual DARE, certainly Scared Straight, even most of how we do driver's education, how we teach about nutrition, how we teach about sex in schools has been flat, and worse than flat in many cases. It's made things worse, and we have lots of data to show that. Now, hang on one second here. You might ask, why is that? Why is it that kids believe that they are not invincible? Why is it that kids believe that risks are so great? So what I'm going to do is show you a very brief clip here from Mean Girls. This is Tina Fey's movie. And in this clip, this young woman here is just going to reflect upon how she learned sex education, and you'll see a couple of short snippets.
I guess I'll never know what I missed on that first day of health class.
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die. Don't have sex in the missionary position. Don't have sex standing up. Just don't do it, promise? Okay, everybody take some rubbers. You're gonna be having a lot of urges. You're gonna wanna take off your clothes and touch each other. But if you do touch each other, you will get chlamydia and die.
So what Coach Carr is talking about here as the health teacher is he is basically scaring kids, threatening them. And this, God bless them, they listen. They listen and they believe the risk is really high. So the kids are listening. They're paying attention. They're soaking it up all over the place. But the information alone isn't enough. And that's the key point here that I want to make, that your kids, it's fine to remind them of the risk. It's fine to know the risk. But when you tell your kids what the real risk of pregnancy from one-time unprotected intercourse is, it's not that high. It's around 5%. But whether they know that or not, whether they think it's 95% or 5%, it's not really going to help them to protect themselves, because they're not going to base their behavior on that information. So that's the first thing we have to understand. Now, there are some people who have what we call an optimistic bias. This is a picture from Lake Wobegon, this fictional town that Garrison Keillor had a radio show about for about 30 years. And he joked and he said, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. And this is called, actually, this is a funny quote, it's called the Lake Wobegon effect, and it's called self-assessment bias. And we all have a little bit of self-assessment bias. That is, we all believe that we're going to beat the odds. So if you're married, think for a second about whether you imagine you'll get divorced. And if we were in an audience, I might have you raise your hands. How many people think they won't get divorced? And most people would raise their hand. And I would say, well, look, you've engaged in self-assessment bias, because in this country, nearly 50% of people get divorced after a first marriage. It's about 45%. It's about 65% for a second marriage get divorced. I might ask what age you think you will be when you die. A morbid question. But in this country, if you're a man and you said over the age of 76, and you're a woman and you said over the age of 81, you're demonstrating self-assessment bias. You think you're going to beat the odds. And if you're a professor like me, and you ask a bunch of professors like me whether we think our work is above average, 94% of us will suggest our work is above average. Well, that's impossible, right? We can't all be above average. There's no average. Optimistic bias is similar to self-assessment bias, but it's around the risks we face. It's the idea that we might beat the odds when it comes to risk. And we believe that's due to something called pluralistic ignorance. That is, I know I shouldn't drive drunk, but when I drive drunk, I take special precautions that other people don't think to take. Like I put on a CD where I know the words to every single song so I can sing along, or an MP3 if you like. I roll down the windows even if it's cold outside. I turn on the air conditioning. I put both hands on the wheel. You know, I never put both hands on the wheel when I drive, so you could argue that when I'm drunk, I'm actually even a better driver because I'm totally in it. That's pluralistic ignorance. I do that. I think nobody else does that. Everybody else does that, thinks that no one else does that. So we all do these things. It turns out, actually, that adolescents do have optimistic bias. Many of them think at times that they'll beat the odds, but adults have just as much, and in most studies, adults have more. Maybe since we've lived longer. So the concept here is that, again, in sum, adolescents don't think they're invincible, far from it. And even if they have optimistic bias, adults have just as much, if not more. So neither of these factors explain why risk goes way up in the adolescent population. So let's talk about why adolescents, part 3, part 2, check. Part 3, why do adolescents really engage in risky behavior? What's really driving that? And a number of these things you've said, I'm going to list them here, and then I'm going to get into them one by one. Brain maturation is a component of it. The reward system in the brain is part of it. Hormones are part of it. Peer effects, the pain of social exclusion, behavioral contributions. All of these things we'll talk about now and break down. The take-home point is that these things are not an accident. These things are not bad. These things are exactly what adolescents have been built to do. And what I'm going to argue, and what I argue in the book, is that these things actually are a big evolutionary advantage for our species. These things have helped us to survive. That's why they're there. Whenever you think of anything in biology, you have to think about what is its point in evolution? Why is that thing there? Why do we have a tonsil or an appendix or a whatever? There's a reason, and these things have to be looked at in that way. And these factors actually have promoted our survival as a species. So these are things that are there. You're not going to make them go away. What you got to learn to do is work with them. The adolescent brain isn't an accident. It's a perfect evolutionary design for our species. Let's talk about the neurodevelopmental imbalance theory. So this is kind of a cartoon here that just shows you two parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and you've all probably heard this argument. This is the executive function part of the brain, the CEO of the brain. This is where we make our decisions. This is where we kind of hold on to our short-term memories. This is where we decide what we're going to do and hold our attention. And this is something that's not terribly developed in kids. It's still growing, so it's light colored here. It's darker in adolescents. It's really dark in adults, because by then this part of the brain is not only only fully developed, but it's fully networked. And these little lines are the networking lines, which are dashed a little bit, hashed a bit here and hashed on both sides here. And they're connecting here to this part of the brain called the striatum. And the striatum is the emotional part of the brain in this case. It's called the ventral striatum. And it accounts for a lot of structures in the brain. But what it basically says is that that's growing at a different pace than the prefrontal cortex. So these things are a little bit out of sync. When you're young, before puberty, they're both sort of growing and on their schedules. But as you hit adolescence, your striatum gets red hot and grows really quite a bit in advance of your prefrontal cortex. And it's not until you become an adult that your prefrontal cortex catches up. And in fact, this part of the brain, this emotional part of the brain, starts to cool a little bit. And that's what this is trying to show you here, that it's chronologically, the prefrontal cortex is growing at a certain pace, but the striatum grows earlier when kids are younger, this red hot area here. And you've witnessed this in one way or another because you know that young people can experience love, hate, anger, jealousy, and really know what those things are by 13, and they can really hold a grudge. At 9, they don't hold a grudge as long. They forget about it easily. They sort of let things go typically. But the older you get, the more of a grudge you can hold on to. You can feel those emotions, but you're still not processing them as an adult would. So this is kind of that observation, a way to think about it fancifully is Romeo and Juliet. You know, they knew each other 4 days. They had 100 words between them, and yet they fell madly in love and had to be with each other. And 4 days later, they both died for each other. And they hardly spoke to each other. 100 words between them. She was 13. His age, we don't know, but he probably wasn't far away from that. So very young, passion takes hold. Now, this argument is interesting, and it has some validity, but it's not perfect and it's not enough because there are many societies, particularly more native societies, where kids have to grow up faster, where you see not the brain changes any different, but kids at 18 are really acting like adults because they have killed their first big game, they have had their first child, and they are responsible for a household. And they're a little more impulsive than those who are 10 years older, but not as much as this drawing might suggest. Still, we do know that this process goes on until at least the mid-late 20s. In my book, the subtitle takes you 12 to 26 is sort of the age range I'm talking about. But we've actually, even since the book came out a couple of years ago, seen that there are a few signs that some of this is still even changing up until the age of 30, some of this networking in the brain. And here's a nice quote from Heidegger, a philosopher, who says that every man is born as many men and dies as a single one. And I think that's kind of a nice quote, the idea that when you're born, you have kind of a blank canvas, not fully. And yes, there's all sorts of genes and predispositions, but you've got some roads, but the roads aren't too tangled up yet. And there's a lot of choices about which way to go. When you're born, your brain doesn't know if it's going to be a baseball player or a gardener or God knows what. And so your brain's pretty open to lots of sort of different possibilities. But then you start to make choices. And after puberty, the brain starts to get, or by puberty, the brain starts to get really wired and kind of clogged, like this chunk here of the LA freeway. This is the wires are going everywhere. The nerves are connecting at all sorts of angles because the kids are trying all sorts of things and the brain is growing and spreading thousands of synapses or connections every second through adolescence, up until about around puberty or early puberty. The brain is just trying to figure itself out and what's really important. And around puberty, the brain actually starts to prune and we start to cut down after puberty the kind of networks. And in some cases, there are times when people lose, again, thousands of synapses per second. And you end up with a brain more like the adult brain, like a superhighway. So the contrast between these two brains is that this one has lots and lots of connections, but the pathways aren't very thick. This one has fewer connections, but the pathways are really quite broad. And so this is the process of moving from gray matter to white matter in the brain. The brain actually of an adult is much more efficient and moves much faster, as much as 3,000 times faster than an adolescent's brain. But if you have a chance to learn an instrument or to learn a foreign language, you really want to do it under the age of 15 or start it because you're really going to have more gray matter like the child's brain and be able to network it ultimately into a much more efficient freeway, neural highway. So kids are going through these changes and this is part of what's happening in the brain. And this is part of the reason kids take risks as well, because their brains are a little more, I don't want to say jumbled, but they're not as, their pathways haven't been as established yet. And so they actually consider a lot more things than an adult might consider, because the adult's brain is much more formalized and put in place. Now, there's an argument about the reward system as well. And this is just a cartoon of the ventral tegmental area. This is a part of the brain where dopamine comes from, and dopamine moves all over the brain for different purposes. But one of the things it does is to go to the frontal cortex and to go to the nucleus accumbens reward center of the brain. And we have more dopamine in our brains when we're adolescents than at any other time of our lives. More dopamine means that we're more turned on by rewards. There's some really good things about that, because, dopamine tells us that there's not just a reward, but that there's a promise of a reward. In fact, that's what dopamine really gets going. The first M&M is always better than the 10th M&M. It's the idea that it's coming. The appetizer is better than the dinner, at least to your excitement. And this is common for young people too, and we learn by that. We learn by having a little spark of dopamine going. So the first time you had an M&M, it blew your mind. It was amazing, and dopamine really went flowing. And now every time you see M&Ms, the dopamine starts to flow again, and it starts to get you going, and you get pretty excited. And that leads you to that behavior. Now, when a young child of 7, 8, or 9 learns that you must make a baby by putting a penis inside of a vagina, that is a shocking thing. And that is kind of mind-blowing. Maybe you were 5 when you learned that, and you think, why would anyone ever do that? That's insane. But when dopamine gets involved around the teenage years, all of a sudden that becomes a very exciting thing because it feels good. And we do all sorts of things that feel good because of dopamine. Eating a cow. Cows are cute. Why would you eat a cow? It tastes good. Why does it taste good? Dopamine. Drinking wine. Why do you drink wine? It feels good. It tastes good. Why? Dopamine. Taking a roller coaster ride, jumping off of a cliff, doing all of these exciting things, parachuting. Why would you do that? For fun. Dopamine. Dopamine drives us to these behaviors. And in most cases, dopamine is trying to lead us towards those behaviors that are going to help us to survive and pass our genes on. And that's why dopamine is so high in adolescence, because kids have to learn. They have to learn what's going to help them survive. And so it must feel really, really, really good. And sex does. And it feels even better in adolescence because they need you to make babies. The species, if it's going to survive, need you to make babies.
What's going on here,
baby.
man?
This is Amelia's first time having chocolate.
This is a baby trying chocolate for the first time. She doesn't know what to expect. But she gets pretty excited. She likes it. And now look what happens when the chocolate comes again. Her mouth is open. She's ready. She can't get it in her mouth fast enough. She's just ready to get it in there.
All right, no more until your first birthday.
So the father's teasing her, being a little sadistic. But the point is here that this child has just tried chocolate and it blew her mind. And that's dopamine acting. And when you're a teenager, it's acting in spades. It's really high. There are other hormones that matter besides just neurotransmitters like dopamine. There's oxytocin, for example, which increases your empathy and trust in the peer group. So that actually oxytocin, which is the bonding neurochemical, the neurochemical that helps to cause uterine contractions and expel the baby, and is released when you hold your baby and when you look in the eyes of people. You may have seen these YouTube videos where if you look closely in someone's eyes and just put people who don't even know each other, strangers, just stare at each other's eyes for a minute within about 2 feet of each other, that you walk away and you ask them questions and they'll say, yeah, there's something about that person I really liked. I don't know what it was, but when we look in the eyes of each other, we release oxytocin. Oxytocin makes us feel connected, and it helps to build a peer group. We need that to be really high during adolescence because we need them to make babies and pass on the population. Dogs, interestingly, not cats, but dogs have lived with us humans about 15 or 20,000 years, and they too have this oxytocin method. They have tapped into this so that when we look at dogs, we both, dogs and us, release oxytocin, which has allowed us to bond with dogs. Cats have lived with us for about 5,000 years, and they haven't caught up yet. So cats are much more aloof. They are less connected. I'm sure some of you have cats that you can't believe how connected they are, and yes, that can happen. It also may be part of your imagination because they just don't have this brain capacity. Now, testosterone is another factor. Testosterone is higher in adolescence than at any other time as well. And testosterone isn't just about really aggression. It's about connection. It's about competition. Even Tibetan Buddhist monks compete not only in soccer or arm wrestling, but they compete in who can be the most compassionate. And the the testosterone is elevated. So it's not about fighting, it's about competing. What are you competing for? Popularity, so you'll be the right mate. Why is FOMO, or the fear of missing out, so painful for young people? Because this is vital, because the neurochemicals are telling them connect, 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 do everything you can to get close to each other, because you need to mate and pass on the species. And we can talk back to this and we can work with this, but we have to understand it. We can't simply act like it doesn't exist. This is what's driving our kids when they engage in risky behavior. Some of you said peer effects in the chat box, and that's exactly right. What do we know about peer effects? We know that when a young person, an adolescent, a young adult, or an adult drive when they're alone in the blue boxes, they make about the same percentage of risky decisions, or have about the same number of crashes in driving simulators. But we also know that if you have a peer watch an adolescent, a young adult, or an adult, that only the adolescent's risky decisions increase, only the adolescent's number of crashes increase, not the others. So having a peer watch an adolescent, e.g., more kids in the car, increases the risk greatly, because the peers, again, are competing. They're trying to outdo, they're trying to show how cool they are, they're trying to show what a great driver they are, they're trying to show how they're devil may care, and they can go as fast as they want around that curve, whatever it is, because they're trying to increase their reputation and how they're viewed, so that they can, you guessed it, get the right mates, get the right nesting spots, become the most popular in the crew, whatever it is. And if you look at their brains, you see the same thing. During these experiments, if you look at their brains, you find that the ventral striatum, that part of the brain involved in reward, is jacked up. And the frontal cortex that is monitoring this behavior is quieted. Only amongst the adolescents, only when a peer is present. And in fact, even in these driving simulator studies, you don't even need to have a peer present. All you have to do is tell the kid that someone's watching from the other room behind a one-way mirror or on a monitor, and they will start to make these risky efforts. Moving on, more about the brain, more about why adolescents take risks. What's the most painful experience you've ever had in your life? Think about that for a minute. And if we were in the same room, I would ask you to raise your hand and say, for how many of you was this a physical pain? And then I would say, for how many of you was this an emotional pain? And 95% of people, that is, unless you've had some very severe physical pain or been in the hospital for a while, almost everybody says the emotional pain. The loss of a pet, the loss of a grandparent, the loss of a relationship, a breakup. That's the most painful thing. And it turns out that adolescents' response to peer exclusion, and this is the experiment. I'm not going to explain it to you because of the time we have, but I'll tell you a few things that are interesting. We only have one brain. It weighs about 3 pounds, and it controls our whole body. And so the brain has had to be really efficient. And we only have, therefore, about one set of pain receptors. And those pain receptors work not only for our physical pain, but also for our emotional pain. And so emotional pain is very, very real. And our neural response, our brain response to emotional pain, in this case, peer exclusion, mirrors the response to physical pain. It's the same thing. And if you look at the brain of a child who's been excluded, what you see is the same part of the brain. The brain's pain receptors get activated. And in fact, if your child is very emotionally upset, you can even give them Tylenol or Motrin, and it will quiet that pain, because it's real pain. It's not imagined pain. We talk about a broken heart. We talk about hurt feelings. These things are actually real pain to the brain. And so social attachment has essentially piggybacked on the physical pain system. And again, it makes perfect sense. It has to really hurt to be excluded, really genuinely hurt. Otherwise, you wouldn't mind being excluded. And you really better mind being excluded, because evolutionarily, to be excluded is to not propagate the species, is to not survive, is to not live a life of your own with some contentment. Without a partner, you can't do it. And so we need to feel this significantly. And that's what this research shows. And so if you think about, again, risk-taking behavior, what would a kid do to avoid pain? Everybody's jumping off the bridge into the river below, or you're dared to do it. And if you don't do it, you are put in the adjective, whatever it is, you're or not the adjective, the noun, you're a jerk, you're a loser, you're a wuss, whatever it is. And so what will you do to avoid that pain and people teasing you forever? Maybe you jump off the bridge, maybe you just go for it, because that drives a lot of risk too. So those are the main brain factors and body factors. And then we have a bunch of other things that happen during adolescence. This is largely because of dopamine and peer effects and some of the things we talked about earlier, the pain of social exclusion. But all drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and everything else increases in its use in adolescence. And you can see there's this hump for every single drug that we can identify. This is when people start to use it. And if you go to the 26 and older population, almost nobody becomes de novo, brand new, a drug abuser or drug dependent. It's very rare for someone at 40 to become an alcoholic or a chronic marijuana smoker or an opioid abuser or whatever if they didn't start when they were younger. So all of these factors contribute to develop an evolutionary advantage, and that advantage is the adolescent paradox. Our kids at an adolescent age are healthier than they'll ever be. They run faster than they'll ever run. They throw a ball faster than they'll ever throw it. Their temperature control is better than it will ever be. Their pain tolerance, heat and cold tolerance is better than it will ever be. But they die at about 300 times the rate that they did before they were adolescents and that they will after they become adults. And that's the paradox. They're super healthy and yet they die due to accidents, suicide, and homicide. And youth is not wasted on the young. In fact, the evolutionary argument here is that we need young people to take risks. We need this little fish to climb up on land, right? In this comic, we need him to climb up on land and take the risk that he's going to die and not breathe because we got to explore the land. We got to propagate. We got to keep moving. And so we need young people who will go out and do it. That's why they are the strongest and the healthiest. But it doesn't always work out for them, as we know. So part 4, how do adolescents make decisions involving risk? Now you know why they take risk and something about how they're built for that. So let me tell you about 2 couples, and we'll use this to sort of walk through this concept. And again, were we together, we could do some hand raising, but this is John and Nancy, and they're middle-aged, as you can see from the picture, and they meet at a conference. Now, they met the year before at the same conference. They're both married. They both live in different towns. They like each other. They're attracted to each other. They're having a stimulating conversation, and they're in the bar after the day's meetings having a drink. This here is Michael and Susan, and they just met tonight, and they are having a drink. They both have a boyfriend, a girlfriend. They're in other relationships, but they're meeting at this party. They're sitting around a keg having a beer, just like John and Nancy are at the bar. They're having a drink, and they're flirting with each other. So the first question I have for you would be, which couple is more likely to hook up in the current vernacular? And most of you would undoubtedly say the younger couple, but some of you, smart Alex, would say the older couple, and maybe you're right, who knows, maybe that says more about you than about anything else. But okay, but the big question I'm interested in is who considers more data? Who thinks about this decision more when it comes to whether to hook up or have that affair? And think about that for a second, and which couple do you think thinks more about it? Now, again, if we were in a room, this is a powerful moment because most of you would say that John and Nancy think about it more. And that's exactly what we would think, right? John and Nancy are adults. They have been through things. They've either had affairs or known people who've had affairs, or they've had a sibling who had affairs, or they've seen enough television and movies and read enough books to know that means this. And so they would really think this through. How's it going to affect my spouse? How's it going to affect my children, my future? Wow. But Michael and Susan, they're new to life. They're young. They're 17. What do they know? They may have never had an affair or know anybody who has an affair. Well, maybe they have, but probably not. And they're not really sure what to do. And they're attracted to each other and their hormones are raging. So what do they got to think about? Let's hit the bushes and go. But in fact, this is the developmental reversal. And this matters too in how we think about risk programming. In fact, it turns out that Michael and Susan think about this more. They think about this decision more precisely because they're young and they're new to it. And so they've never encountered this or encountered it once, not 100 times like John and Nancy have. So they're really thinking about this decision in a very detailed way. And this is where they get into trouble often because they're weighing so many risks and pros and cons. And they're trying to debate, what do I do? What do I do? And this often leads to the justification of a bad decision. Let me give you an example. About 10 years ago, I came home and I said to my wife, so, sweetheart, is it a good idea to eat a salad? Is it a good idea to exercise every day? Is it a good idea to sleep 8 hours? Yes, 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 of course. I said, is it a good idea to swim with sharks? And she said, nope. And I said, is it a good idea to light your hair on fire? And she said, of course not. And I said, is it a good idea to drink a can of Drano? And she said, stop the stupid questions. Immediately she answers no, right? She knows this because that's the way the world is. You don't drink Drano, you don't swim with sharks, and you don't light your hair on fire. My 13-year-old enters the room. Her name's Parker. I say, Parker, is it a good idea to eat a salad, sleep 8 hours, exercise every day? Yes, 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 Dad. I said, is it a good idea to swim with sharks? And she says, huh, what do you mean? I said, swim with sharks. She's like, well, am I in a cage or am I like swimming with sharks? Because some sharks, are pretty safe to swim with, I think. And some like great white, I wouldn't want to swim with a great white, but like there's some other sharks that I could probably swim with, and that'd be kind of cool. But if it was a dangerous shark, would I be in a cage and would I have a harpoon and could I be pulled out and have enough oxygen? So lots of qualifications, but she's really exploring the question. I say to her, is it a good idea to light your hair on fire? She says, okay, do you mean like all my hair or just a piece? Because if I came to school tomorrow with a piece of my hair that was singed, that would be a really cool story. I said, is it a good idea to drink a can of Drano? She said, Dad, what's Drano? Well, there you go. And that's what our experiments show. Our experiments show that actually adolescents take more time to make these decisions because precisely they have not been confronted with these things before. And so they're really digging through all of this decision-making process. And what we know about advanced decision makers, and advanced decision makers are adults who've been around and done a lot of stuff and had a lot of practice. Practice is the big thing. Advanced decision makers hone in on patterns and gist. We call it the gist. They get the gist. They get the big picture. They don't need to parse out every detail of the affair. What would my kids think? What would my husband think? What would my dog think? What the older couple, John and Nancy, think is, I'm either the kind of person who has affairs or I'm the kind of person who doesn't have affairs. And yes, there are exceptions to every rule, but by and large, I'm either going to do this or I'm not. And I know. And after one drink, if I'm not that person, I'm going off with my other friends, or I'm going to go have dinner, or I'm going to go upstairs and call my spouse. That's what I do. But the younger couple, they're like, Michael and Susan, they're trying to figure it out. Well, what would happen? How would I do this? Is there a place to go to have sex? Do I have a condom? Do I need a condom? She looks pretty healthy. I don't know. What I tell my parents if I come home late, they're going, did I even take a shower today? They're breaking down every detail. And we know that advanced decision makers don't do that. They just go at it. So that physicians, as examples who have been studied a lot, physicians with experience make much better decisions with less information. In fact, when I work with the medical students or the residents, they know so much, they're so smart, they can go through every little detail, but they miss the forest for the trees all the time. So we know that, and they make actually worse decisions by considering more information. And we've done studies with nurses and firefighters and cardiologists and pilots and drivers, and a lot of this is in the book. It's fascinating stuff, but the take-home point is, if you have experience, you tend to consider less information. This was a beautiful quote by a guy who was a monk near where I grew up. I grew up in California, and this guy's from Monterey, and he said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. And so this is really a great quote to suggest, again, that the more experience we have, the more narrowly we see things. Now think back about the health programming that we do around decision-making with young people, like DARE or Scared Straight or, zero tolerance policies. We're trying to teach kids to think like us, but we don't really think like we've been teaching them to think. We don't really break down everything in bits and pieces. We just like drinking and driving. Bad. Don't do it. Done. My brain doesn't have to work that hard. Take an easy path that's really a well-worn, trafficked, those big superhighways in LA, a big pathway that is well established by now. I get it. I don't have to think about it and run it in circles up the flagpole. All right. So now we get to the final part of the talk, and that is, what can we do differently? And I'll walk you through some general principles, and then we'll talk about a number of specifics. It's coming up on 9 o'clock, and I'll take about another 10, 15 minutes to walk you through strategies. And then if we have time for Q&A, which I think we do, we can talk specifically in more detail about this. So what are the guiding principles? The first thing is, giving them more information won't help. Not only do they have the information, but more information doesn't change their behavior, and they already believe they're at more risk than they are. So let them believe it if you want. Doesn't matter. More information isn't going to help. Any 12-year-old knows that driving drunk is a bad idea. You're just not going to find one who doesn't know that. It's okay to remind them, hey, be careful, etc. But there's a way to remind them, and we'll get to that. So the next thing is that you want to focus on practice, because that's how we've gotten to be good decision makers as adults. We've had a lot of practice. We screwed up a lot of times, and they're screwing up now sometimes, and sometimes getting it right. And we've decreased our screw up ratio, and we've increased our do it right ratio. And we got to help them with that. And we have to expect that they're going to screw up sometimes, because the cards are stacked against them. Their dopamine, their testosterone, their oxytocin, their brain structure, their peer pressure, all of that, their pain receptors, all that is driving them to take risks and to put themselves out there. So we have to remember that. Health classes in many cases have discouraged good decision making, because they teach kids to do the pros and cons in the moment. And that's not something we want to do, because they'll overthink it. So no pro and con lists in the moment. You do that before. You do that at home, at dinner. You do that at the therapist's couch. You do that wherever you do it, but you don't do it in the moment. And then emotional salience. If kids actually feel, remember all that feeling stuff is going on in adolescence. If they actually feel they're at risk and they feel something bad can happen, that's where the money is. So focus on emotion, and I'll give you some strategies with that as well. And finally, as you know, adolescents aren't fully mature. They're just still growing. Their bodies aren't fully mature. Their brains aren't fully mature. So we should limit risks where we can. So our efforts should rather encourage this gist understanding, automatic, non-deliberative decision making. Don't think about it too much in the moment. You can think about it before, but not in the moment. Shelter young kids and early adolescents as much as possible. Try to modify the environment. We'll talk about some strategies. Provide apprenticeships. Think about moms and dads when you were younger. You probably yourself or knew somebody who had a job, maybe a paper route, something like that. Those kids were responsible. They were up at 4:30 in the morning, folding the papers, delivering them. Those kids who did babysitting were really good about it, or nannying. We don't have that many opportunities for kids like that anymore. And it's a shame, because you learn a lot from apprenticing. So what can we do very specifically? Well, we know what kind of parenting strategies work. We've known for years about parenting, and I don't remember if I've given you a full slide on authoritative parenting coming up or not, but I will walk you through it. There's basically 4 types of parenting that have been articulated since the mid-60s, and we've studied them 6 ways to Sunday, and we know which ones are better than others. There's authoritative parenting, which is, I love you, I support you, I care about you, and there are rules, and these are the rules and how you follow them, and if you don't follow these rules, there are consequences. That's the best. Then there's authoritarian parenting. Why? Because I said so. There's permissive or indulgent parenting, kind of do whatever you want. And there's negligent, I'm not even paying attention. All the other 3 that are not authoritative result in not only negative scholastic and behavioral outcomes, but they also result in more mood and anxiety problems, more obesity, more hypertension, more cardiac disease when people hit adulthood. Because there's something about living within a structure, having some room, and being able to make some natural mistakes, but also knowing where the line is, that really helps young people. So structure is very helpful. And we teach authoritative parenting through what's called behavioral parent training. And we should be teaching this in schools. It's one of our structural changes that would be helpful, because these are basically behavior modification techniques that work with kids, and they also work with your subordinates at work. They also work with, the waiter at the restaurant. There are many very good techniques that we can teach. Close monitoring makes a difference. You don't have to be there every second, but knowing what your kids are up to, knowing where they're at, being able to connect with them and follow them actually makes a big difference. So apps like Life 360 or Find My Phone, as a parent, the phone is something we'll talk about in a minute, but I don't mean spying on your kids. They should know that this is happening, that you know where they are. But knowing where they are is really powerful for you, and knowing their friends and knowing their friends' parents, that's really useful, because it becomes a community and things aren't so scary and things aren't so out of touch. Talk to your kids about risks and drugs and sex and condoms, because if you don't talk to them, they will get that information elsewhere. They will find it online, where half of it's ridiculous and wrong, or they'll find it from their peers and half of it's ridiculous and wrong, and they will get confused. So you need to have these conversations. Sometimes these are terribly difficult conversations to have. What you end up doing is sometimes saying to your kids, I want to talk to you about sex, and they shut the door. And so, you give them a book and you leave a book that you feel comfortable with, a book on the human body or a book on sex if you want, or you bring it up naturally, or you talk to them in the car because they can't get away, but you got to be driving. So you're driving, you're with them, and that's a good time to have a conversation about sex because they can't go anywhere. Anyway, but these kind of conversations are important and very useful. Focus your interventions on kids who are at high risk of substance use. So not all interventions, but when we do our global teaching about substance use, we haven't yet shown that teaching everybody about drugs and alcohol makes a difference in terms of their drug and alcohol use. So we don't have a method for that. But we do know that if we can identify kids at risk and teach them, that actually makes a difference, not only for those kids, but for kids around them who often follow those kids in their drug and alcohol use because they're the cool kids. So identifying kids who are at risk because they've had prior drug and alcohol problems, because their families have drug and alcohol problems, because they have, shown up drunk at school or at a dance or something like that, getting those kids help and support actually makes a big difference. Reframe reward. Remember, our kids are driven by dopamine, so try and find places where they can be rewarded for good behavior. And we can talk about a lot of examples, but identifying places where they get credit for that. Providing safe risks, because part of how we learn is by experience, and we don't want to take that away. So skateboarding, and if you can get your kid to wear protective equipment, great, but that's can be a safe risk. Or bicycling, or, amusement parks feel really risky, and they get a lot of those yayas out that our kids want. That's a good way to experience risk. Maybe some other things that are safe. You can jump out of a plane. I've done that with my teenage boy, and we jumped out of a plane at 15,000 feet. It was one of the best experiences of his life. It wasn't one of my best experiences, but it was okay. But it meant so much to him. We went bungee jumping. These kind of things help to moderate some of that risk. They don't make you more risky, but you can connect over that too. Highlight the short-term benefits of not taking risks. Kids don't really want to lie to their parents. They will, but they don't want to. They love their parents. Even the most ill-treated kids still want to impress their parents and connect with their parents on some level. So try and highlight the benefits of not taking risks. Here's the authoritative parenting that I said I would talk about. I think I went over this already, but I've told you all these good things that happen when you raise your kids with authoritative parenting. It also results in less growth of the threat center of the brain, the amygdala. And we see this in imaging studies. We can look at the brain and we can see that the threat part of the brain that gets angry and agitated is calmer in kids who've been raised by authoritative parents. And the brain reward center is less demanding. So that's something that's very important to think about. And the parent management training is how we achieve authoritative parenting. And the techniques sound simple, and many parents will tell me, oh, I've done that, but they didn't really do it enough for long enough, creatively enough, etc. So a lot of the time that a child psychiatrist works with parents is on this kind of stuff, providing positive reinforcement, using effective commands, selective or active ignoring, scheduling well, rewarding good behavior, setting limits with consequences. And the only punishments we ever use are taking things away or timeouts. And that's not much, actually. I mean, and what parents often do is they take things away for weeks or days and days, and that's not the goal. A punishment that lasts longer than 24 hours is rarely valuable. Kids remember that you're mean, but they don't really remember what they did. They think you exaggerated whatever the issue is. We get much more from these, first 5 things. You learn a lot from making a mistake, and you can teach a kid a lot by making a mistake. And in some cases, you learn a lot more by making a mistake. But they do much better with these things. And often we have so many choices about what we can reinforce and how we can reinforce it. But you don't have that many punishments. You have a timeout, and you can take something away. Their phone, their computer. Complicated because they often do schoolwork on those things. Clothes, makeup, how much stuff can you take away? But you can give a lot, and you can manage more that way. All right, enhanced supervision. The more parents know about their kids, the fewer risks the kids take. And the more parents communicate with their children, the more the parents are seen as trustworthy. So that's why we want you to talk to them, because then they start to trust you. They start to believe what you're saying, and they start to ask you things. And they ask it in sly ways sometimes. But if you don't talk to them about it, they'll think you're not interested. They'll think you don't know. They'll think you're totally out of touch. So there you go. After-school programs, curfews, and leisure passes have been found. There's a really nice program in Iceland where they actually reduced cigarette smoking to the lowest rates in Europe by essentially setting up curfews. in the community by giving families that didn't have much money a pass of $2,500 a year to take their kids to the movies or take them bowling, and they required after-school programs. It's ironic that our kids start school so early. We could talk about school start times too. That's a big feature when it comes to risk, because the earlier kids get up, the less sleep they get, because their cycle by high school, as you know, is delayed. Most of our kids want to go to bed late and wake up late. They have trouble going to bed early. It's very hard for them. So what happens is they end up going to bed late and they get up early. And then they have these days that end at 2:30. They come home, or maybe they have an after-school activity, but often they have nothing to do but homework or whatever. And we're not home till 7 or 8. And so they've got 5 hours unattended to be at home with their boyfriend or girlfriend, to go smoke weed behind the park, whatever it is. So knowing what our kids are doing and then giving them these after-school activities. In Iceland, they mandated after-school programming, learning programs, music programs, sports programs, arts programs, and their behaviors like smoking and unprotected sex and drug use and alcohol use went way, way down. Screen time. Well, we know more than just a little about this now. 75% of kids have at least one electronic device in their bedroom, 45% have a television, a third of whom keep it on all night long. The median number of devices in kids' rooms varies, but it increases with age. And screen use impacts the brain and is associated with all these things. And you can look at this list, but essentially, the more you are exposed to screens, the less well your brain functions. And there's a modest amount, of course, that you can be exposed to. And if you need it for work, you need it for work. That's a different kind of screen use. But the games, the shows, the more kids use, we understand increasingly, the less gray matter, which means less potential the brain shows. Reduction in frontal cortical lobe thickness, that's where decisions are made. Reduction in attention span, poor memory and thinking, enhanced reward sensitivity, give me more rewards. I care less about the losses because I can always get another life in the game, so I can always get another life in this game. They have signs of cravings and most of the, obesity, lots of things. And our most recent study shows that decreases in the white matter, which is important for learning language in those centers of the brain, even in pre-K kids who've been spending time watching more television, more than 2 hours a day, than the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends. So there's actually a real correlation here. We don't know if it's totally, the only thing that matters, but we're certainly seeing it increasingly. And when a cell phone is present, here's my cell phone over here in the corner. You can't see it, but here's my cell phone. And if I were talking to you and I had my cell phone within your line of sight, on the table or maybe sticking out of the back of my, on a holster, let's say, where you could see it, you would report, as people do in every study, that there's less of a connection here. He's not really paying attention. He's sort of still distracted by his cell phone, even if I never pick up my cell phone. You have less trust in your conversational partner, less empathy, you believe, is coming from your conversational partner. So lower quality of relationship, less closeness. And this is why I say God created the fruit bowl, because this is where your phone goes when you come home from school until your homework is done. You use something like, you postpone screens as long as possible, and then you consider a program that allows you to know where your kids are at. You postpone social media at least until 13, and you make sure that your kids friend you. Now, of course, they can develop aliases and all the rest, and I'm not saying you spy on them, but at 13, to have a supercomputer in your pocket that could send people to the moon and back, oh, just think about what's online. Come on. I had one dog-eared Playboy magazine that I found at 15, and I kept it under my bed till I was like 18. These days, that's so tame compared to what a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old can find online with a few keystrokes. How can these kids ever leave their room with all the access to the information and pictures that they can get hold on to? So know at least a little bit about what kids are doing. You own the phone. The phone is yours. Under 18, you can't even own a phone legally in this country. You certainly can't buy a phone plan. So when you give your kid a phone, you say, I own the phone. This is mom and my phone. And, you're going to use this phone and you can call it yours. We'll call it yours because it makes sense, but it's really ours. We're letting you use this. And this is something that only good behavior will allow you to keep using and keep having. And if you have problems because you can't reach your friends or you can't reach us, oh, well. The country is actually safer in terms of things like, kidnappings and child abductions than it ever has been in our world. Our kids don't need these phones. Someone nearby always has a phone. They don't need them. It is a useful thing. It's fun. It's exciting. It allows a lot of correspondence. One of my kids is overseas now, and it's great. We're FaceTiming. It's lovely to have the phone, but it's not a necessity of life. First work, then screens. First work, then play. That's the golden rule. Screens are a reward, not a privilege. Limitations, consider screen limitations when your kids are younger, like nothing during the work week. Keep all screens, computers, TVs, and shared spaces when kids are young so that they can't be in their room in mischief. If they must be, then the doors are open. If the screens are in the bedroom, stop screens at least an hour before bedtime. Technically, literally, you'd want it to stop at 3 hours because of the flow of the blue light coming off the screens, which blocks melatonin. If you must have your kids on screens, then you could consider something like flux or night shift so that when it gets to be dusk, the screen dims and they don't get the blue light blocking their melatonin so they can sleep at a normal time. Here's just an example of my son. He's Julian, and his phone, this is about a year ago, his phone use. So the screen time app in the iPhone is really useful. Other software programs have something similar too. And you can see that he was on his phone. He was in high school at this time, almost 3 hours a day, which for a kid isn't that bad, honestly. Most of it was spent during the week on online, Instagram, messages, Snapchat, some other fun stuff. You don't see a lot of Wikipedia here. And if you look over on this side, what you see is how many times he picked up the phone on average per day. He picked it up 139 times on average per day, and he received about 109 notifications per day. That's really distracting. And most schools let our kids have the phone in their pocket or have it wherever they want it. If it comes out, yeah, they say, we'll take it away if we see it, whatever, but that often doesn't happen. So how distracting is it for you to get tapped on the shoulder 109 times in a day? Pretty distracting, so much so that you'll pick up your phone 140 times a day. So how do you learn? How do you have a conversation? How do you engage with reading, with good behavior when you're constantly being tapped into? And by the way, this is also part of what increases risk because you're so interested in what's going on in your social world and tapping into that you get all that FOMO, that fear of missing out, which taps into that brain pain receptor and contributes to more risk. What can we do? Help our adolescents understand. So adolescents are really interested in justice very commonly. Why is the world this way? The world's like all safe and beautiful until you're like 12, and then you read the newspaper and you finally can think abstractly and you're like, oh my God, the world's a mess. You get it. And you're like, whoa, this is crazy. And then it gets pretty scary. And then you start to often as an adolescent care about things. And you're like, I don't want to be manipulated and told what to do. The man's telling me what to do, my teacher, my principal, the president, my parents. So you can frame that for them. Actually, the man is very commonly a corporation, a business that's trying to sell you risky behavior. So we need to be teaching media literacy in schools because a lot of what looks cool is what the corporations are selling our kids. And we need to use positive images. So here's just a nice ad that I saw a few years ago. There's George Clooney. He's got a business partner. He makes a tequila called Casamigos. It looks kind of fun, and it's great. They're making this tequila. They're in Mexico with their laborers here in the agave fields. They're driving motorcycles, vintage motorcycles. What is this phrase here? It says, our casa is your casa, mi casa is su casa. This is great. It looks cool. I want to drink tequila and be like these guys. I want to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. I want to drink and drive. That's what this ad is telling us. And it's remarkably irresponsible of George Clooney to allow an ad like this to go out because this kind of thing is read by young people as, isn't this cool? Hey, this is great. I got nothing against tequila. I got nothing against drinking. I got something against drinking and driving. I got something against riding a motorcycle without a helmet. So much of our tax-paying dollars are put into keeping people alive and caring for them when they get into an accident and don't have a helmet on. And I don't think that's right. I think they should be taking better care of themselves. I think they ought to be. And I think that we shouldn't be promoting alcohol and driving, and certainly not without a helmet. Fools, not cools. Here's, who plays Nintendo GameCube? Well, nobody anymore, but this is about a 10-year-old ad. But at the time, who played Nintendo GameCube was adolescents, and we're selling them beer as adolescents. This is an interesting ad. This is just a bunch of adults, so they can think for themselves, and it's a cigarette ad. They're just on a roller coaster having a good time, and Live with Pleasure in Newport, and it's a bunch of Black people. And this ad would not be offensive if it weren't for the fact that cigarettes are overly marketed to Black people, so that there are up to more than 10 times more tobacco ads in Black neighborhoods than in other neighborhoods. Why? Well, it happens that people in poverty, people in minority neighborhoods, which are impoverished neighborhoods, often smoke more, generally smoke more than others. Why? Well, addiction is more common in those neighborhoods. Life isn't as good in those neighborhoods. It's easier to become addicted. It's easier to seek solace and some comfort from substances. And so we see more use. And what the tobacco companies is, they know that. They target those neighborhoods and they advertise there. This is an issue of social justice that we should all be thinking about and paying attention to. It's true with mentally ill. The mentally ill smoke more, and partly they are marketed towards this. It affects poor, homeless, racial minorities, LGBTQ, all these populations who are disenfranchised in our society smoke more for a variety of reasons, but the companies know it and they target it and they help to make it happen. And now we're seeing juuling, of course. And so, while cigarettes go down, juuling is going up, or other sorts of e-cigarette use. And the e-cigarette use is just replacing the use of tobacco. And here are some juuling ads for you. And they look like, oh, what's this guy doing? He's got bleached hair. He's cool. Why the jewel's in his eye? I have no idea. She's so happy to have her jewel. This one here has got such attitude. She's so cool with her jewel. Look at this one here. This is funny. This is a pose that is a whole lot like Ariana Grande's pose here. And so you can see the company's actually borrowing thematic views from people who the adolescents admire. So again, big corporations are taking advantage of our adolescents. They're trying to make it look cool. I think that we could point out to them this factor, that jewels and other vaping devices were theoretically built to get people off of tobacco. In fact, you're much more likely to use tobacco. Here's an alcohol ad. You don't have to be a physician or a urologist to understand the anatomical linkage here between these cherries and this bottle of vodka. What is the suggestion? If I drink vodka and get drunk, that I'm going to get this kind of treatment, or that I'm going to get this if I use Tom Ford's cologne, or the chauvinism in this ad here: smart may have the brains, but stupid has the balls. Buy these jeans. Okay, be stupid, get diesel jeans. Or this advertisement I pictured off of a building not long ago, just about a year ago: thirsty, come inside, Coca-Cola. Or this even more overtly sexual ad: it'll blow your mind away, the BK Super 7-incher. So again, while some of these ads are funny to us and remarkable, the other factor is that these ads are ways that we sort of try to or companies try to sell stuff that is risky to our kids. There's a variety of reasons that this isn't a healthy behavior, but the nutritional aspect of it is part of it. All right, what else can we do? We can acknowledge that risk is low, but the consequence is dire. So if the kid says, look, the risk of one-time unprotected sexual intercourse resulting in HIV or herpes or whatever is low, that's okay. But the phrase that we want you to use is not don't overdo it, take it easy, be careful tonight. It's once is all it takes. That's the gist thinking. Once is all it takes. Yeah, 5% risk of pregnancy. And you know what? 20 times, you're going to get pregnant at least once. And it could be the first time, second time, and third time, because you never know. Once is all it takes. You got to use a condom or not have sex or what have you. Use analogies. Would you play Russian roulette for $1 million? There's a 1 in 6 chance you're going to die. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you're dead. So this is a way to think about things help kids think in gist, to keep it categorical, big chunks, instead of breaking it down into its subparts. More things we can do. Developing emotional and personal cues are really helpful, so that, I mentioned before that when adolescents really feel something, they're more likely to follow their behavior. So develop emotional cues. What would happen if you got pregnant? I wouldn't get pregnant. Well, but then what? Then what? Then what? And the ultimately dropping out of school, or having a baby, or having an abortion. What does that feel like? What would your family think? What would you think? So these are the kinds of things that are important to think about. And practicing red alerts, identifying what those red alerts are. Home alone after school with a boyfriend. That's a red alert. That could be a situation where there's trouble. And then teaching kids schools. I mentioned that some of the DARE programs that are working these days are actually teaching our kids proper skills. So practicing and rehearsing refusal skills. My parents drug test me. I have a swim meet tomorrow. Maybe next time. Role play. Make it natural. Teachers can do this, but parents can do this as well. If you don't want your kids to drink, don't drink. If you don't want your kids to drink too much, don't drink too much. That's just the way it is. I think that kids role model, and yes, there's a difference between adults and kids, and there's legal age and all the rest of it. But if they see you getting drunk, that is a sort of permission. Use frequent reminders, because it's okay to remind them. Plan decision pathways. Back to that idea that we want to tell them give them an opportunity to think things through, but don't think it through in the moment. Have a decision already planned. So cold cognition is when you're calm and relaxed. But our adolescents, when they're in the moment of risk, when they're thinking about getting in the car and they've had 2 beers, or is it 3? When they're thinking about having sex but they don't have a condom, those are hot cognitive moments. The brain is already really jacked up and activated. So you want to have these decisions made in advance at moments of cold cognition and discourage risk benefit in the moment. There's a lot we can do to teach kids how to regulate their emotions. It's one of the major developmental milestones of adolescence. So teaching emotional self-regulation is useful. I can talk more about social norms marketing if you want, but the concept here is that kids understand that not as many people are doing things as they think. So if you look at how many people have had sex by the time they graduate college or high school, you could say it's almost 60%, it's high 50s. But that means that almost half haven't had sex too. And so you can focus it that way. Well, a lot of kids haven't had sex. And when you ask these kids how many have had sex by the time they graduate high school, most of them will tell you 90%. They always overestimate. How many of your friends had a cigarette in the last month? 80%, but it's about 15%. So that can sometimes be useful. They're not missing out as much as you think. And when you talk about numbers, actually, I said percent, it's much better to use ratios because 5% is a difficult concept for the best of us, but 1 in 20 we understand. There's a lot more we can do, and we can talk about this if you want. Limit phones in schools, emphasize sleep, nutrition, and exercise, adjust school start times and enhance after-school programming, sex education, making condoms available, targeted drug abuse prevention, school-based mental health clinics, mentorship, teaching resilience via neuroscience. I can get into that as well if you like. And in society, these are bigger things that we should all be thinking about: poverty, mentorship, policies, and drug and alcohol laws. But we can save that for the bigger picture. This is the book I wrote that has all this information and more. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to entertain your questions. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and we can go from there.
Dr. Shatkin, thank you so much. This is phenomenal information. We will, for people that have questions, go ahead and put them either in the chat or the Q&A, and we can read them. Get to a couple of them. We did have one question for the students. You said the majority are not having sex or making, using drugs or alcohol. Are there ways to continue to make those good choices in this unique season that we're in?
Well,
kids at home.
I want to be clear. The majority of high school students by the time they graduate have had sex. But yes, you're right. Maybe it's 30% of sophomores, maybe it's 40% of juniors. So I'm not condoning anything. I'm just saying that that's what it looks like. So can we help them keep making good decisions? This is a very difficult time, and COVID is what COVID has done, likely for the next year or more, has really changed our world, and we will see outcomes of this down the road. We're already starting to see some mental health effects, for example, more substance use, potentially an increase in suicide rates. So these are major concerns. And I think we parents have to work very hard to engage and keep engaging our kids and keep them safe. I think the one silver lining to this is that we're home a lot more, which means we can actually be involved in our kids' lives a lot more. And there's an awful lot of learning that our kids don't get in the way they used to. I don't know about you guys out there listening, but I had home ec once upon a time as a freshman, and I took it to meet girls. I was one of 4 guys in maybe a class of 40 people. And I met some girls, but I really learned how to cook, and I learned how to sew, and I learned how to do a bunch of other things too. I learned how to use like ammonia to clean a floor. I mean, there were things that I just didn't know, and I'm actually a pretty decent cook, and part of that's just from becoming an adult, but I really learned how to follow a recipe and do things and bake bread, and that was huge for me. And I think that some of those practical skills we can take on at home now, typing and athletics and cooking and shopping and, driving. Your kid can get a lot of driving practice if they're of age. So I think that, and that may take something out of us as parents to do that. But, we had kids in large part to spend time with them. So there's an opportunity here for us to do more of that. I don't know if that answers the question, but those things occur to me.
Yeah, that's great. We have a few coming in. At what point would you recommend parents helping seek professional help, I think, for their kids? What are some of the behaviors and actions in teenage kids that are red flags? What should they be looking out for?
Sure. So there are a lot of things, and I think you seek professional help when you think you need it. When you think, first of all, at a grand level, you feel like you're out of your depth and you really need some guidance or support. And seeking professional help may not always mean bringing your kid in. It just may mean you going to someone like a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist, a social worker, or someone at your school to get some help. But the red flags really are when behavior changes. When you start to see your kid's sleeping pattern change, when you start to see your kid having, a different physical appearance, taking less care of themselves, clothes are a little stinky, eyes are a little red, irritability increases, grumpiness, isolation, friend groups change, grades go down, teachers report concerns. So this is where the rubber hits the road. Now, by then it's getting late. It's not too late, but it's getting late because changes are already ensuing. So you want to stay up on those things. You want to pay attention to your kid's sleeping pattern. And these things change over time, but they don't change drastically typically. So you want to know, what happened to Ben? You used to spend all this time with Ben. I love Ben. Where'd Ben go? Don't ignore that. Stay with it, stay attentive to it, because that's where we start to see depression coming in, anxiety getting in the way, drug use starting to happen, those sorts of things.
Thank you. Are there any predictive analytics that you can suggest for identifying students who may be at greater risk for future misuse, aside from ACEs?
Yeah, so ACEs are helpful, but you won't know those about a lot of kids.
Sure.
Prior use, it's it's not late, but it's already starting to happen. But that's where schools will often notice, because they're starting to already see the kids who were caught smoking cigarettes or weed on property or whatever it was. So those are things to pay attention to. But parents, the kids who are at risk of drug abuse typically have a family history. So if there's a family history of drug abuse, that is a first degree relative, a sibling or a parent has a history of alcoholism or other drug abuse, then it's time already, even if your kid hasn't used anything, to do more education, close monitoring, and support. And what exactly to do, honestly, isn't entirely clear. We don't know exactly how to prevent these problems, but we do know that targeting those kids does make a difference, in that if we can keep those kids from using, the longer we can keep them from using, the less likely they are to use. Again, if you get to 25, 26 and you haven't used, or if you haven't gotten into abuse or misuse, the risk that you'll use or become a misuser are really quite low. Much higher risk when they're younger, and much higher still if there's a family history.
Thank you. One parent noticed his teenage daughter's been losing some of the motivation in this season, which understandable, and they're simply doing the bare minimum. Would you say this would be a red flag?
Could be. It could be. I think, again, you always want to do the best you can to stay in touch with your children, to talk with them and to understand what's going on. And I would be straight about it. Hey, you seem like you lost some of your zhuzh. What's going on? And maybe that's driven by the isolation to some degree. If that's the case, let's see if you can figure out a way to get her less isolated. If that has to do with friends and problems that have ensued, then maybe trying to follow up and see what happened and can you be helpful, or maybe a therapist would be helpful there. Is it the kind of schoolwork? Is it, anxiety, what have you? So try to identify what it is. It might be a red flag. It might be something else. But, kids go through a lot of changes in these years, as we talked about tonight. And girls have high rates of depression. And so about a quarter of females will have a depressive episode by the time they're in their early 20s. So that's a lot. And they'll mostly get through it, but most of them will come back again later. So the earlier we cotton on to this and we help, the better. And mostly because when you get depressed, you easily kind of fall off of the trajectory. So you want to help people, because also we can prevent future depression from happening.
Thank you. And then one last one, a parent's wondering about her daughter's in college, how to talk to her, tips for talking to her about her risky behavior. She's 21 years old.
So if the best answer to this question, and I hope this addresses you as well, but the best answer is talk about it early. Because if you've talked about it from a younger age, then it's easy to talk about when they're 21, because you've had these conversations before and they're not unfamiliar. And so if you've got a 9-year-old or a 12-year-old at home, having these kinds of conversations early is very useful. So that's the preventative approach. But at 21, maybe you've talked a lot to her, maybe you haven't. Again, I think the place to start is usually a place of inquiry. So tell me about what's going on in your life. I want to know. I want to understand. I want to appreciate, and continuing to ask about their life and not to assume, because they're very sensitive to our assumptions at that age, high school and early adulthood. So, tell me what's going on. I'd like to understand, and try and withhold your judgment. And at 21, again, they can act independently and do. So try to withhold judgment. Try to just understand. If you're curious, let them know you're curious. Tell them you really want to understand things. And then some of your parental wisdom, some of your adult wisdom can start to be suggested. You can ask more questions. Well, you think that was a good idea of your friend who did this or that? What do you think about this? You can even present scenarios that you wonder about. What would you do in this case? Or, I have a friend whose daughter, etc. But usually starting with inquiry, being curious, helping to guide that way. If your 21-year-old's coming to you and asking for support, that's great. But she knows right from wrong. So what she's dealing with is whether to engage in these behaviors or not. And you can be helpful, but you can't tell her what to do anymore. So let her feel like she can trust you and tell you things, at least some of those things. She's never going to tell you probably everything, but you can ask. And if she feels it's safe, she'll tell you. And then you have a chance to offer your wisdom, and not with a wagging finger.
I love that. We had one slight one. I think this is a good one. Any recommendations on how to go about having the sex talk? She said she tried the coach car approach with their oldest child, and it was kind of comedic.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I think it's great to just start with questions. And depending on what age your child is, you can ask, all sorts of things. You can ask if she has any questions or he has any questions about sex. That may be too bold, but it's still good to ask a question. They may say, no, of course not. You may want to provide a book. There's some wonderful books. I gave my kids sort of human anatomy books when they were young that were for kids, just calling parts by their proper names. That, I think, was a useful start. And my daughter didn't want to accept it from me, so I left it in her room. And then I asked questions about it for many days afterwards. Have you had a chance to look? What do you think? Let me tell you, I don't want to talk about that. Okay, that's okay. So I need to do this. So I'm going to tell you a few things. And I'm just going to talk, and you can look away if you want, but they're absorbing it and they're listening. As far as the sex talk goes, I think it's great to use proper names for things. If you have family fun names, I got no problem with that. Some people do, but I think that's fine. But I think kids really do have questions about this. They may or may not know exactly what a blowjob is or what 69 is, but those things are out there. They're hearing those things. So I think having those conversations with them is valid because they're curious. And when you talk about them, they become less taboo. And that doesn't mean that they're going to do them. We know from studies all over the world, USA, Canada, Western Europe, New Zealand, Australia, talking about sex, even having condoms available, does not increase at all the number of kids who have sex or the frequency with which they have sex. All it does is increase the likelihood that they will use a condom if they have sex. So having condoms available at school, I think, is a brilliant idea. It cuts down on pregnancy, and pregnancy is the number one reason girls drop out of school. Having these talks, having very plain talks, having discussions. I know it's awkward, but you just start dipping your toe in the water. You share things that you've read. You talk about ideas that you have. You talk about kids you knew in school and the problems they had. You ask them questions, and you start with where they're at.
Wonderful. Dr. Shatkin, thank you so much. This was phenomenal. There's lots of comments coming in just about how thankful they are just for all of this information. We will conclude just to be respectful of people's time now. Again, thank you so much. And we are always looking for parent volunteers to join Stand Strong Coalition. So if you're interested, you can email standstrongcoalition@gmail.com. And then once this webinar ends, you'll have a screen that'll pop up with a survey. We would love if you could take our post-event survey. We host an event like this every year, so we really value your feedback. Also, if you are a licensed clinical social worker who attended and are interested in CEUs, there's a separate survey that we'll have you take. We'll share that information in our post-event email. And then again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We wish you and your family a warm and healthy fall season. And thank you so much, Dr. Shatkin. I know everyone's virtually clapping from their homes. We really appreciate you.
Good to be with you. Thanks, everybody.
Yes. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.